In the 18th century, British aristocrats went on something called the Grand Tour, a leisurely month-long or years-long tour of the cultural highlights of Europe. We're going to do the 45-minute PowerPoint Grand Tour of most of the United States, about a 2,000-mile swath from Pennsylvania, also known as gateway to the rest of the country, to New Mexico and Colorado. And this is the result of my personal interest in seeing what is there, what is out there beyond my area of Virginia and New England, of course, well known. Also to provide, for you all, to provide context for New England and to demonstrate the continuum of forms that one sees across the country. Continuum, but also a lot of variation. So here's a map showing the 16 or so sites that I'm very quickly going to race through from Pennsylvania out to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. I'm going to briefly revisit Long Hunter State Park, which I presented to the November NERA conference. Extraordinary 1,000-foot long linear structure right outside of Nashville, Tennessee. But I'm just going to focus primarily on the crest, the coping on top of this wall, because that's going to be a theme in some of the sites I'll show from Pennsylvania and on into Virginia. One of the amazing things about the structure is the polychromy, the use of color. There are different varieties of stone that were gathered in the area and used purposefully to create patterns. Here you see the transition from a grayish limestone to a brownish sandstone. And the most complex polychromatic figure right here, here's a drawing to show it diagrammatically, has sort of a swirl effect, which is actually a motif in Mississippian depiction in ceramics, for instance. All the way to the fact that some of these Mississippian ceramics will have a central button that the pattern sort of swirls around. And then another aspect of the crest, the wall sometimes disappears, but the crest goes on. In this case, the crest is being supported by these mushroom-shaped pedestals. Just an amazing, amazing structure. So moving into the other sites, Francis Slocum State Park, just outside of Wilkes-Barre, has huge orthogonal complexes. Last night when Morton presented on New Jersey, he was showing complexes, these grand assemblages of structures that in and of themselves have sort of a typology. And this is sort of related to that. So the structures are on the hillside to the left in the landscape view. Here's a LiDAR view showing some of the alignments. I'm going to lead through them to this area, this sort of L-shaped enclosure with a lot of topography going on. So again, crests. The walls in Francis Slocum have intermittent crests. Some just have no topping whatsoever. Here's sort of a standard approach with the lean stones. Here's an approach that might be serpent representation with this sort of undulating, humped effect going up a hillside. Here's an area where the horizontal masonry just stops, and you have this sort of mega crest that continues it, and then it resumes over here. Here's that L-shaped enclosure I mentioned earlier on, with a wall on top of a bluff overlooking the enclosure itself. This wall comes down and ends with this little angled termination, little kink. That I believe is, well, I'll show you what I believe it is. Rattlesnake rattle representation. Here's a structure outside of Roanoke, Virginia called the Cahays Mountain serpent effigy with a outcrop boulder head. You know, that's standard for most serpent effigies. And then the same sort of angled tail configuration there. At the corner inside this L-shaped alcove are these huge meter-high slabs of stone that have been leaned up against it. Shield representations, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. A little bit like Manitou stones in some ways. The other Pennsylvania site, Lackawanna State Park, a series of quadrangles. I'm going to focus on the sort of penultimate quadrangle at the top of a hillside. Again, we have the angled or leaned stone crests, but they're intermittent. Just like Francis Slocum, but one wall. For instance, this wall has about 20 sections of the crest, and then sometimes interesting things going on between them. But earlier on, there was an image of a farm from 1830s in New Hampshire, which showed the stone wall, and that actually had a crest. It was very regular, and that's more typical of historic construction. Walls are usually built to specifications, either a spoken verbal agreement between the farmer and his son, or an actual stone building firm. Everything is done to the same height. The crest, when it's present, is mathematically regular. This is the opposite of that. It's syncopated. So here's a tiny little section of the cresting. Here's an alternative approach with sort of a flat coping. And here's where it just gets marvelous. A single stone held up, perhaps a feather representation. A single pinkish stone with some stones sort of like bookends. A little stack at the forefront on sort of a cantilevered stone in front of the angled coping, and another little stack serving as sort of a bookend for a section of angled. It's just wonderful variety. By the way, I'm an architectural historian, so I really get into these kind of details. Here's that quadrangle. Here's the wall that most of those photos are from. A really fascinating aspect is there are these pairs of features in opposition, the same feature on opposing sides of the quadrangle. There'll be two tapers, two entries, and two breaks at an outcrop where the stone, the wall comes over, hits the outcrop, drops down, and continues. Here's the tapers. I interpret tapers as serpent head effigy, or effigies of the heads. When you don't have a boulder that's shaped like a serpent head, but you need one, you build one. And I see this throughout the eastern United States. So here's the upper one with a purposely constructed little niche that might be the eye. And here's the south one. I mentioned this a little bit in my talk back in November with what looks like a stone that's sort of fallen into a random crack, but I believe this is all purposefully constructed. This stone is actually supported by a little corbel. It looks wedged in, but it's all very contrived. I think this is serpent monsters in Cherokee belief, for instance, and some other narrative traditions are always being destroyed by some culture hero. There's always some epic battle and they die horribly on the mountainside and the remains are left behind. I think this is serpent monster destruction representation. They're serpent monsters, but they're part of a broader narrative that existed in the culture. And in fact, these constructions might even be part of that narrative, sort of conveying it through time. Yeah?
One thing, I was out with a shaman woman once, and she talked about a power stone being removed. Looking at that eye and the niche, I could just see somebody having like a white stone that they might put in there to, like, you know, when they're doing their ceremony. So it's something to think about, that maybe that is taken with them and brought them back inside.
Whenever you see a niche, it sort of implies something was placed there, yeah. And I'll actually show a white stone in a niche later on. Here's the the two entries with these little wing walls. Very rare in historic construction. I mean, it's functionless, but it sort of emphasizes entry. And here's where the walls hit these outcrops and cantilever over them. This one is practically leaning out over it, and then continue on. Oh, so right under this outcrop is this almost perfectly rectangular, I'm assuming natural niche, but this might have been a precipitating factor for placing the wall at that location. This really odd-looking niche existed there. Moving into Virginia, more crests, Reed Gap, almost mathematically regular in this particular case. This is the Blue Ridge Mountain complexes are often wall complexes. They rarely have piles or cairns associated with them. This is an exception. There are a number of wonderful cairns right next to the wall. Here it is again with a sort of L or a rectangular turn, another pair of cairns. Some details of the cresting on the reed wall. Here's that sort of almost a mega crest, although the wall continues on under it. This is more typical of what you see on this particular wall, or in this area actually. And then here in the slope below, here are some piles and cairns, sort of your standard garden variety stuff you see all over New England. Humpback Mountain, right on the Blue Ridge Parkway with some Forest or National Park Service signage, which is completely wrong. It says it's a hog fence. Goes for about 4 miles along a mountain ridge, dips down into the valley, has all sorts of amazing stuff going on, all sorts of breaks that I think pigs could sort of wander through. So for various reasons, I don't quite buy that. I mentioned it going down. This mountain is around 3,500 feet high. By the way, all these Virginia sites I'm showing, all 4 or 5 of them have the Appalachian Trail passing through. So at the base of the mountain, this is sort of the beginning of the wall, follows a creek. The creek becomes a trickle, becomes a few seeps. Wall follows that, keeps going up. Breaks, as I mentioned. Here it is running into the base of a cliff. This is looking down about 20 or 30 feet. Here's a section of the wall with, here's crest stones, but they're especially elongated and pointed, and they're shimmed. They're held up by stones to hold them more erect. I interpret this as a wing effigy. And again, this is based on a Moundville ceramic. Here's a serpent monster with a big old wing from the Mississippian period. So that section of the Humpback Mountain wall butts into the base of the Humpback Rocks, which I think was perfect for vision practice. Don't know that, of course, but everything's sort of pointing to that function. The wall breaks for a while, then continues on, goes to another peak of the mountain that you can sort of vaguely see there. This is what that peak looks like. It's this huge scree pile with more jutting rocks at the top. And among the jutting rocks, near the top, this wonderful sort of ovoid enclosure. I mentioned how the Reed Gap complex was mostly wall, also has some cairns. That's sort of unusual for these Blue Ridge Mountain, Virginia complexes. You'll have these immense walls and no piles, or very few piles. Right near Humpback, the only piles I've seen are this tiny little collection of stones here and this one on a boulder. However, about a mile away, on one of the passes leading up to this mountain, is this enormous complex. I've seen just the edge of it. It's mostly private land, but you can see these sort of terrace-like effects or elongated cairns going up ridges, and it's just, I don't know, what's that, 1,000 structures maybe? Here's another of these, about 50 miles away, another wall complex on Coal Mountain. A view looking into the Shenandoah Valley from the top of the mountain. This is the southern terminus, and it has a few piles associated with it. This is the northern terminus. It's like a big loop that almost closes. It goes around this 3,500 or so foot high mountain, and like a U that almost forms an O. Here's a great LiDAR view of that other end. There's actually a little angled termination there above a spring. Hits these rocks, goes through, hits these rocks and outcrops, and breaks into an alignment of piles and cairns, one of which actually sort of reverses polarity and goes perpendicular to the general trend, resumes again, hits the base of this outcrop, and then jumps up on top of it and continues on the Appalachian Trails right here. So getting back to the southern terminus, it's going down to an outcrop. There it is, serpent head with the wall riding up on top of it. However, you go around the side of this outcrop and it sort of changes appearance. It initially looked to me like a roosting bird, almost like a whippoorwill. And I thought, well, maybe, maybe not. I since learned that the Algonquin term for stone altar, recorded by John Smith in 1607 or so, was pacorance. Pacorance was also the word for whippoorwill. Amazing. That has to be a relationship. Here is that southern termination wall. It becomes undulating. More undulation further up the mountainside. Then, this is that undulating section with this interesting sort of bridge cairn. These little bridge cairns occur where the wall ends and then continues as little fragments. So these are both examples of a continuation. My interpretation of these, this one is associated with that undulating section, and these are elsewhere. But my interpretation is this might be what's called a synecdoche, which is something that represents the whole, like the term the crown. When you talk about the crown in British politics, you're talking about the monarch, because the monarch wears a crown. The crown symbolizes the whole. I think these may be symbolizing the eye and horn of a horned serpent monster. That's a guess. Another further southwest Virginia complex, Bruisers Knob, huge, nicely crafted cairn complex right near Blacksburg, Virginia. Here it is in LiDAR. Right along a high ridge that actually, this side is Mississippi drainage, this side is Atlantic drainage. So that might be a placement factor. Here's a little gap that I'll talk about a little bit later on. Also has various linear features on the edges. Norman earlier showed an inclined cairn. This has that sort of inclined ski jump form. A lot of them have these sort of beehive or domical forms. This one has a basal niche where the 4-foot long stone they use as the lintel had this little protuberance that hangs down sort of like a fang maybe, or a stalactite. Big old slab leaned up against it. I'm going to move around back of this, and it's sort of hollowed out, and you have sort of a stepped edge here, and this leaned stonework here. It actually leans inward. Interesting. Turns out there's another cairn just up the slope that has almost exactly the same thing. So I don't think it's a remnant of partial collapse or something. I think this was intentionally constructed with this form. One possibility is this is an egg, a broken egg, with the stonework representing that broken shell, with the yolk or whatever the contents pouring out. This Bruisers Knob complex is what I call a dry complex. It's on a ridgetop. There's no water source. Below it, there's another huge complex with multiple springs sort of bubbling out of the ground, which I consider a wet complex. I think there might be Thunderbird serpent monster symbolism going on. Perhaps this is a serpent monster, or excuse me, a Thunderbird egg. That's a little speculative, but that's what occurs to me. Here is that mountain. Bruisers Knob is right here. It has the appearance of sort of a structure on top of another structure. And I'm seeing this in a number of situations throughout the southeast, possibly temple representation. The actual, what the effigy is a temple on top of a mound. I mentioned the wet complex that's in a hollow right here below that gap. There's actually another wet complex at the other end of the sort of raised section. So Dutton Gap, right on the boundary of Virginia and Kentucky. This is a rectilinear enclosure that built right on a cliff. What it looks at is this flat mountain with a little butte. Perhaps another temple representation, or interpreted as that. Here is the enclosure, one wall of it, and then it goes like this, and then there's the other end, and then looking from the other side. This is literally the state line, that little edge. The downslope or inner wall is somewhat more diffuse, although it has some interesting features, such as this stacked stonework holding up a larger stone. I call this columnar stacking, and it seems to be sort of diagnostic of Native American construction. Or when you see it, it represents that, because in the examples of the historic wall construction we've seen, there's bonding across the face of the wall for strength. This is different. It's little stacks of stones. This is, again, returning to that Cahays Mountain serpent effigy, just 3 different views. Where the stonework, it's stayed there for hundreds of years, so it's well built. Perhaps it's tied in at the back, but across the face of the construction, it's columnar. And then here it is in other states. Moving into Cherokee country, Lackawanna State Park, Francis Slocum in Pennsylvania, huge orthogonal complexes. Virginia, you don't see that, and then you get to the Smoky Mountains and you see it again. And I'll show 2 complexes, starting with Webb Creek, big quadrangle with a single pile within its confines, and then actually an entry over that corner. Here's LiDAR showing that is that location I just showed. There's the pile. And here's the boundary of Smoky Mountains Park, and then anything that was on the other side was blitzed by a campground. Later on I'll talk about this feature and this feature. So here are some details of that orthogonal wall. Here's another tapered wall end. Use of quartz. Quartz cobbles are lying around on the ground. They could have been randomly incorporated into the fabric. However, they're patterned. Here's 3 in a row. You have stacks of 3. You have other things going on. So it's intentionally incorporated in a decorative or polychromatic fashion. Here's the niche with the quartz cobble. Here's the close-up. Also this interesting sort of cigar-shaped stone. I actually tested this for lithophone properties, and it was a dud. Just went bonk, no ringing or anything. Outside of these orthogonal complexes are big, close-set pile and cairn complexes. And returning to that LiDAR view, I'll talk about this natural landform, which I believe is also interpreted as a man-made mound. It just happens to be natural. And I won't talk too much about celestial alignments. I haven't really considered that too much. Frankly, I don't think that's a major factor here. I could be wrong. However, this is due north-south, connecting this quadrangle, presumably originally connected to that landform. So that technically is celestial alignment. And here is that landform. Now it's a water slide, sort of an ignominious end for it. That pouch-like form that I also showed has this sort of bench, this stone revetment or wall built along its lower pouch-like end. And here's that lower bench-like section of it. Maybe about 5 miles away is another of these big orthogonal complexes with a huge cairn. This is Ole Hill's scale. That stick there is about 4 feet high. Here it is on the other side. And then connecting to it is this sort of umbilical, this stone revetted little tiny creek that starts at the cairn and goes on. There it is, going down, connecting to this lower, more diffuse pile. You put your clipboard down in the Smoky Mountains, and in a minute, it's covered with moss. It's just amazing, the vibrant growth there. And this theme of sort of lining things with stone is everywhere. Jim Wilson has documented the Berlin walls here in Pennsylvania. Very similar sort of cursus type arrangement. Here it's built along a creek. This is actually another of these tiny little rivulets that's walled on both sides by stonework. More of these tapered wall ends, these two facing each other, so this little passage that you go through them. Some of these cairns have a little serpent effigy aspect to them. This is one, perhaps it's the head, and there's the taper. And this site also has a natural landform, which I think may have been interpreted as a temple or a mound with a temple on top. It's this conical hill with this outcrop at the top, with this sort of leaned structure, a large wattle and daub temple with a high-pitched thatch roof would have had somewhat of this appearance. And then right below it is a wall with a little angled termination sort of starting and heading on to more orthogonality. So Matt, I'm about halfway through. Am I doing good on time?
You are.
Okay.
I'm your timer.
All right. Heading further south into Georgia, Fort Mountain, which has a very interesting historical element in relationship to what Nera does. This was the research focus of Philip Smith back in the 1950s when he recorded and was one of the first to do the sort of Native American interpretation of what's going on with these stone structures. So there's the zigzag wall or feature on top of Fort Mountain. And yay, good, actually accurate interpretation and showing Philip's drawing and talking about his work there at Fort Mountain. A little bit further south into Alabama, into some complexes that Harry Holstein, who's presented to Nera, has documented on Choccolocco Mountain. I love saying that word. This is one of the southernmost ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. And here's Harry's, one of his very detailed site plans of just this huge, extensive stonework that goes along the ridge of the mountain, including these sort of concentric stone lines here, which focus on two tiny little springs. It's so interesting that all this stuff that seems so insignificant to us was like the major focus of this construction. And there he is pointing, there's Harry pointing at the spring. And they're sort of, people call them terraces, but they're not really terraces. Over time, a little bit of soil is built up behind them, but they're just concentric walls that were built in this sort of bowl-shaped hollow. And then wonderful enclosures, possibly vision quest structures on the mountaintop. This one's larger. So that looks like that could be anywhere in the Appalachians in the fall. That is actually the Ouachita Mountains on the border of Oklahoma and Arkansas. I had no idea there were mountains in Oklahoma, but there are. So I'm going to talk about Rich Mountain. It's sort of an east-west ridge in this range. The Talamina Parkway links a town in Arkansas with one in Oklahoma. It's sort of like the Skyline Drive or Blue Ridge Parkway. It runs along the ridge. Unfortunately, it blitzed right through this huge complex here of little stone walls and clusters of piles. And actually, you can sort of see them there in the underbrush. So this is typically what you see when you walk those lines. But sort of apart from it is this interesting rectangular enclosure, superficially like a foundation, but very irregular, peaks and lows, and what I interpret as another wing effigy. Perhaps the wing here is a thunderbird wing rather than a serpent monster wing, considering the context. And then right over the line in Oklahoma, there's a wonderful high elevation spring called Horse Thief Spring, which has some historic period stonework, but also this interesting sort of rectangular enclosure that goes around it. So as you see, I'm going southeast or southwest and then westward across the country. For my own satisfaction, I pretty much decided that wherever you had abundant stone, you often had this kind of stonework. So it's interesting that a lot of these theories, these sort of historic period theories of what's going on in New England are very New England specific. They don't explain what's going on outside the region. Same kind of stuff. So there is stuff going on in Kansas. I was right here, now I'm leaping over to the Rocky Mountains. There's actually some interesting petroforms and cairns that have been documented in the Big Bend area. So it's not a complete break, but really it picks up again once you get to the Rockies and you have a lot more abundant stone. So here's the Snake Nest site. Wonderful, huge snake effigy, which you might see in Virginia or New England. Here it is winding over the hillsides. At the very northern end of the San Luis Valley, which has the Great Sand Dunes National Park, a lot of interesting water features. This is a hazy day, but there are times in wet weather when this is just lakes, these wonderful sapphire-colored high elevation lakes. So the walls climb the hillside up to this very interesting outcrop. They plug into the end of it. And here it is on the other side. The owners and the archaeologists who have researched this have proposed this as a serpent head swallowing prey. So it's both representational, but it's also representing visually, but it's representing a behavior, serpent type behavior. And actually, Norman's image from Ole Hills with that huge rock boulder, to me, had a little bit of a serpent head aspect to it. Okay, dipping down to New Mexico, Villanueva State Park. This is on the Pecos River, right where the Pecos leaves the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a range of the Rocky Mountains, and starts heading out into the plains. And it's also a canyon where there was Pueblo period development. So this is upstream a little bit. The Pecos River is down at the base of this bluff. This is the village of Villanueva. And then this is this large ovoid enclosure. And I'll focus in on the interpretive sign there on the left, which is interpreted as a corral used by insurgents. And these insurgents were supposedly sort of renegades or rebels against the American presence in New Mexico in the 1840s. I don't think so. Someone also didn't like the term insurgents. But it's very irregular. Insurgents running from the U.S. Cavalry. If you were going to enclose your remuda, your little herd of horses, you would have tied a rope around them. They would do a rope corral or some brush piled up. There would have been no reason on this prominent site next to a village to build this massive stonework with this kind of feature. There is a wall right along the bluff near the corral overlooking the river. And by the way, there are little, just like in New England, you have a wall complex, you also have little piles here up on the slopes above the corrals, quote unquote, is this little pile on top of a boulder. And then here's that wall with various high-piled peaks, and it breaks into a series of cairns. I never really thought about it. That looks like a little niche there, a little basal niche. So, of course, Chaco Canyon is famous as a center for ancestral Puebloan development right around 1000 AD, give or take a few hundred years. And the massive multi-story Pueblo cities that were built in the canyon. But it's also home to a lot of smaller scale stonework, very similar to what you see in the east. Here's one of them up on the mesa top overlooking Pueblo del Arroyo. Sort of ovoid, rectangular ovoid structure with this little standing stone aspect to it at that corner. It's overlooked by, this is just the tip of it, a little raised terrace, stone terrace, which might have been seating for some sort of performance going on here, which then also possibly was visible from the Pueblo down in the canyon below. And the canyon, the mesas sort of step up. You have this little rincon, this sort of alcove, and then at the top is this cairn overlooking it. This has so many weird aspects, this double niche, this sort of pointed end. Perhaps it is representational also, possibly an owl. There are a number of sites in this area of New Mexico where natural features have sort of an owl eye appearance. And then in the Beastie Badlands, sort of north of Chaco Canyon, you can probably spot it right there, way out on this wonderful little peak, cairn. Now, of course, this could be Puebloan, this could be Navajo, could be Comanche, who knows? I haven't been there. And there's sort of a sense of some other construction going on. And of course, when you're in New Mexico, the thing you need to be most careful about is not offending the mountain gods, because they'll get you. So those are the images. I can go back and show anything else, and certainly answer any questions you may have. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Did you notice any correspondence with the breaks in the walls, with the wall going up next to the creek?
Not a one-to-one correspondence. It does tend to break up more as it gets higher, and the creek just becomes a little series of seeps and trickles. But
Thanks.
sure,
Sir,
yeah.
the ones especially in northeastern Pennsylvania, the trees that are within there are awfully young. So do you think that maybe these were constructed and then the settlers or people already just said, geez, they're already here, I'll just pasture my cow there or pasture my sheep there, and that kept the vegetation? Because you would think that there'd be stumps or cut over, because this area has been cut over.
Right.
And multiple times, but then it doesn't seem to be any trees, big ones. They're all small.
That could be. I don't have an image of it, but there's actually one area of that wall near the L-shaped enclosure where there is a large tree, and it has. You can tell that over the decades and perhaps centuries, it has slowly shifted the wall. So the wall kind of goes around it like that. This whole question of timber harvesting, I've wondered about that, because that certainly in modern times is a very destructive process. But my guess is that when you're doing traditional timber harvesting, you don't want your tree to fall on stones or outcrops, because that could damage the wood, so you're going to miss it. So selectively, it might actually have helped preserve the stonework. Randomly over the centuries, you'd have random tree falls, but the lumbering may have actually helped. Yeah.
I'm really impressed by the scope of the work you're attempting. And are you trying to be encyclopedic, really, about your coverage of American stonework, or
I'm trying.
sort of on the style of Squire and Davis, but with rocks instead of mounds?
I'm trying to be as geographically extensive as I can. New Mexico is as far west as I've gotten with the field work. California has the East Bay walls, some of you may have heard of, on the heights above San Francisco Bay, which behave very much like the walls here in the east. Alaska, especially the Alexander Archipelago, has hundreds of cairns and piles. It's really rich in that regard. The high plains of Canada and a little bit of the U.S. have the various medicine wheels and other petroforms, which are sort of the same thing as the stone effigies and the serpent effigies, but sort of two-dimensional on the ground. You have much less stonework to work with. I haven't made to Canada yet, I'm sorry, but maybe I will. But yes, I want it to be a North American-wide survey.
Wow, great.
Yes?
The slide, it was in New Mexico, was that a cairn on top of a huge rock? Yeah, is that a cairn?
Yes, it's man-made on top of a natural erosional feature.
So is that constructed similar to what we have here in terms of where the rocks are laid?
Right.
I guess it's hard to tell because you wouldn't be able to look there.
Yeah.
I think we know it's not field clearing.
That's a really interesting question. What is similar?
Right.
It's somewhat stacked. When I refer to a pile, it's just, the stone is thrown on. There might be a ritual aspect to it, but there's not this sort of careful, meticulous stacking. When I say cairn, I mean stacked. Actually, cairns are kind of harder than walls for me. I mean, if one assumes they're representational, what are they representing? I showed those ones that maybe represent eggs, broken eggs. But, one of them also had this basal niche that looked like a mouth with a fang. So that doesn't seem to relate to an egg. However, I showed the outcrop that from one side looks like a serpent head. You go around it, it looks like the whippoorwill or a roosting bird. Mississippian art actually had these kinds of transformations. There's a statuette from near Cahokia called the Berger figurine, which has all sorts of things represented, but it also has a serpent or snake that sort of wraps around the figure. The head end is a feline head. Then there's the serpent. Then the tail bifurcates into gourd vines. So, that makes it harder for us. What's being shown, it might be multiple things sort of conflated. Yeah?
I'll give you a clue, and you may want to put it on your tour someday, but I saw the total eclipse of the sun on Nipple Butte out in Oregon, and it had a similar cairn to that, but just if you're wondering what it might represent,
Okay.
I remember Nipple Butte.
That's an easy image to remember. So.
All right.
Looks like one more if we have time.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
In your travels around the country, have you also spoken to archaeologists or site interpreters, Park Service people, or if you've had those conversations with people around from these different regions, would you say that you could see patterns or differences between the acceptance or pushback that you might get from various, let's say, archaeologists from around the country? Are people in some places more accepting, are places less accepting, that kind of thing?
Gosh, that's a hard and sort of emotional kind of thing to respond to. Certain archaeologists say don't email me anymore. They just flat out dismissive, and they're like, it's all historic. So that's one end of the range. Well, the New Mexican sites I've shown, there's this growing awareness that there are these structures. I don't think they're making the connection between what they're seeing in Chaco Canyon to what you all see in New England. But maybe it's just a matter of time. The Chaco Canyon area was also interesting. I did speak to Park Service people there, to some of the archaeological staff, about polychromy, because outside of Long Hunter Wall in Tennessee, which I presented in November, and a few other sites, polychromy is very rare in the east. It turns out it's also very rare in Chaco Canyon. You have a few situations. There's a salmon ruin, Aztec ruin, excuse me, where there's a line of green stone on one wall of this sort of rectangular pueblo. And then Salmon Ruin nearby, this is just north of Chaco Canyon, has a room with sandstone. All the wall is sandstone, but certain blocks were fire treated to turn them red, and they form this sort of cruciform design. So there is polychromy also in New Mexico. The interesting aspect there is those pueblos are assumed to have been plastered over. So all this color use, would have been hidden. And maybe that was the point. Maybe you produce it and then you hide it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Is that the next one?